The history of heavy.
Dave, it's a heavy brunch today, my brother. It's a heavy brunch. Welcome in, everybody, to episode 20 of the History of Heavy podcast. This is the show that traces the chronology of heavy music across genre, song by song. And today, we are recapping the 1960s to determine once and for all what is the heaviest song, or in our potentially what are two of the heaviest songs of the 1960s before we begin our discussion next week about the 1970s. As always, I am one of your co-hosts, Michael Huntsman, joined as always by your other co-host, Big Daddy Dave Lieberman. Hello, Dave.
I think this morning it's Brunch Daddy Dave.
Brunch Daddy Dave, I love it.
As a twist, we're doing a different format today, and we're in the morning today. So it's like I've got a T-shirt on. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it does feel a little different. We tried to get this episode off a couple of times and finally found a time on a Sunday morning. I am still in Anne Frank's closet. But as discussed last week, we are not, or as we thought we were going to do this week, we are not talking about Black Sabbath. We decided to save Sabbath to next week because we feel like we need to give the 60s their just due and put a cap on the decade before we dive into the 70s with Sabbath. And we intend to do this at the end of every decade. So the goal of the pod, ultimately, when we get through all the 150 some odd episodes, we will recap each decade. And then at the very end, we will determine what is the heaviest song of all time, according to us, which may be, we may be able to just get to next week. We'll see. But
yeah, I've got some things to say about that.
I'll bet you do. All right, Dave. Well, this is typically the moment in the show where we saunter on over to your cultural corner, and you tell us about what has happened or what was happening in the year that we are discussing. We have a whole decade to recap today. So, how are you thinking about the cultural corner?
Dave's Control!
You know, we're doing a retrospective episode, and so I think it's just important for us to take a moment and think about the heaviness of the cultural moment that the 1960s was, and the historically significant moment that the 1960s was. I was thinking about this yesterday. Was very the whole decade is very enigmatic of this generation in a couple of ways. For instance, first of all, it's known as a generation. The hippie generation, the psychedelic generation. It's got different noms de plume. Wow.
Eyebrow.
Yeah, I'm bringing some class. But also, a lot of these things touch my life and your life and our generation. And so it's really interesting that I was thinking about this like with Muammar Gaddafi, right? He takes power in the 60s and is deposed within the last few years in our lifetime. His whole experience, his whole reign of power lasts this spans generations. And so many of these things are touch points and moments. A lot of the technology that we use every day, that we're using to plan this podcast and record this podcast, the internet and text messaging and such, were pioneered. The earliest parts were in the 60s. Uh, the fact that the world is so interconnected, and with air transit and everything, and these airplanes were invented, the 737, and aviation history and aviation safety has come a long way in the time that we've been alive, you and I. Um, so I was just thinking, reflecting about how much the 60s was not only a generation, the not only a genesis of a generation of people, but how the ideas and the cultural things that were happening have had a generation of lifespan itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that we are experiencing kind of the opposite end of things that were born then.
That is interesting. And I think thinking about it as a generation, though not unique necessarily specifically to the 60s, I think is maybe more definitive as it relates to the 60s. As we have talked about the 60s and just the general energy and understanding of the 60s felt like a real community, like there was a connective tissue running through culture and ideology and perspective. And as we get into the 70s and, to keep it within music, disco and cocaine, and then certainly into the 80s, where it becomes much more just broadly about the individual, it feels like, and certainly today, as with the rise of social media and the division in politics and all the stuff that's going on in the world now, it feels much more about me than it does about we. And the 60s definitely felt like a we generation.
Yeah, well said. And it also feels like the nation, and it is referred to as a cultural revolution in America.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we touched on this in several episodes, how culturally the teenager becomes a thing and then becomes a dominant thing, and it happens in this time period. And it also like matures all the way until the funeral of the hippies that happens in 1969,
Mm-hmm.
or at the end of the summer of 1968, I guess. Um, and it just is very emblematic of the time being a zeitgeist, a stream of consciousness that was all encompassing. And I do want to juxtapose that with the fact that it was a certain stream of consciousness, because there was a lot of conflict with the old guard, right?
Sure.
This was a generational stream of consciousness, but pop music and pop culture of the day is something that we would consider a little bit more subversive today. And so the whole generation, culturally and intellectually, was in this subversive counterculture. There was a counterculture movement, right, where you had this the establishment was having a war in Vietnam, and the youth culture and the counterculture was protesting that war in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you had conservative politics in power, but you had cultural revolution that was counterbalancing that and that was working against that. You have the electric Kool-Aid acid test with Ken Kesey, and you have this experimentation with psychedelics and this mind opening and this soul opening, and spokespeople, if you will, like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, who are bringing in this cultural consciousness. And you've got the yogis that are coming into the uh, conversation, and all this Eastern philosophy and spiritualism, and yoga becomes a daily a household word, and the back to the land movement, and you get all this just this like a very spiritual, non-structured, non-church-based spiritual thread that is woven into this tapestry of the 60s that really gives it some of that community and that continuity that you're talking about. It makes it so that nowadays you have, it's hard to say pop culture because, to your point, we're so individualized and so granulated that everybody has their own tribe. It's very tribal. And so pop culture is whatever your tribal pop culture is, whatever your tribal culture is. But at the time, it didn't seem that way, at least from the outside looking in or from the future looking back. It feels like the legacy, the echo, the ripple that we see now is this much more cohesive, homogenous idea. And community, I think, is a really, you said it well when you said community. It feels like there was this community. Now, not everybody was on the same page, obviously, but the the ripple, what was left, right? The footprint in history is what we're talking about because that's what we have as the legacy. The dissenting voices weren't loud enough to last, or their message wasn't strong enough. So while I acknowledge that they were part of the conversation, their argument didn't win. And so the times and the place in history is defined by the winners. And I think that in our context, for our cultural corner, it's interesting to think about the winners and what that means, especially in music and heavy music, because it leaves us a lot of legacy.
Yeah, it does. And I think the community to tribe to individual is certainly interesting in the context of music. You know, this, we've talked about this before, but this is a period of time where that counterculture and the subversive voice was also the popular culture. You know, these bands that, you know, many of which we've talked about and we'll talk about again today to put a cap on the 60s were very, you know, anti-government and anti-establishment and doing things differently and a new way of thinking and all that stuff. This really doesn't happen again until we get to the 90s and we get to grunge and hip hop, where the underground becomes the overground again. And that is the most popular music. And that is what's being played on the radio. And that is, you know, what's on MTV. Hasn't happened since. And in our current consumption model, streaming, I'm not sure it can ever happen again because we are much more individuals now than we are tribes because we are all able to self-select our own radio stations. Let's
Yeah.
Right. So none of us are all hearing the same thing at the same time. So, you know, there is certainly a sense that pop music, you know, the likes of Taylor Swift and Beyonce and whatever, it is the dominant music, but it's not dominant in terms of that's what everybody is hearing. You know, the only thing that dominates music's popularity now really is who's selling concert tickets, you know, because touring is the only way for artists to make a living. But I'm not sure any kind of, you know, if Rage Against the Machine, just to pick a random example, was to rise today, if a band like that was to come today, anybody who wasn't interested wouldn't ever have to hear a note because we're not all listening to the same radio station. We're not all watching MTV. We're not all connected to the same output source. So it's increasingly about the individual, and what I consider the dominant music or the most popular music right now is not the same as you, is not the same as my son, is not the same as my wife, because we've all individualized what voices we're hearing, which is great, but also sort of a drag in terms of our inability to have that community, or really even those tribes that you mentioned.
I mean, I think it's great for the individual's experience, but it degrades the communal one. That's
Right.
all. I don't know if those either of those are good or bad, but just necessarily the more granular we get, the more individual we get, the farther from community we get. And I think that that's one of the reasons people like Taylor Swift and Beyonce become these polarity points where people want that connection and that shared experience. So you go to a concert, and like my daughter's into that, and I watch some of the Era Tour on TV. My God, that's amazing!
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's such a spectacle, and Taylor Swift in particular. I took my dad to see Paul McCartney about 10 years ago, and we're in the stadium in San Francisco, and it was like an intimate night with my buddy Paul. And we're up in the nosebleeds, but the charisma and the ability to be comfortable on the stage and to connect with the audience and just to be down to earth. I saw that with Taylor Swift. I saw that with Paul McCartney. And you really feel like you're part of this moment that is
Mm-hmm.
just happening right now and it's special. You're wearing your LA Dodgers hat, right? I'm not a sports guy, but that's what I've come to understand is such a huge appeal about sports. You're in this moment with this in this shared experience with 20 or 30,000 other people, and oh my God, did you see that catch? And oh no, he dropped the ball. And like, I can't believe they lost it at the end, or I can't believe they won at the end. And it's much less about what I thought it was about was like, oh, there's that guy who's the best at what he does, doing that thing that he does the
Yeah.
best.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it, but I think that's less a part of it than I was there when he did that thing that made history.
Well, not only that, but to take it back to the community aspect, I think live music and sports are both great, or just not just music, period, and sports are both examples. A significant portion of my relationship with my son is based on music and sports, and sharing the experience of those two things. And those are things that we collectively share with other people that are fans of those same things that we're fans of. I took him to see Interpol last year, and he grew up listening to Interpol in my, when I drive him to school, and, we're arm in arm singing every word and just crying, emoting. And then we're, watching the Dodgers win the World Series, and hugging and crying. It's that community experience of those things that we collectively love, and agreed that this is part of where we can express our love for each other through these other channels that aren't just me to saying, "Hey, I love you."
Right.
It's a
Well,
connective
and
tissue.
the counterpoint, to extend the sports metaphor, which is dangerous ground for me. But I understand being a Cubs fan takes some fortitude, or being a Maple Leafs fan
Mm-hmm.
takes some fortitude. And it's like, why would you want to be a fan of a team that loses so often? And I think it's because you're sharing the burden of that experience with so many other people. And you can you're a part of this community, and that community happens to be one of mourning, perhaps. But that's a human emotion.
Right.
And it's a way for people to connect with a human emotion. And so it's just as interesting to me how that communal aspect relates to this decade, and how I see and understand some things that I experience. I have more context to understand them
Mm-hmm.
through this project that we've been doing, and through this realization of the decade as a generation and as a community, in juxtaposition to later decades that come, and how that works with music and how that works with the cultural background that's happening. Um, just to bring it back to the conversation, things like the moon landing, uh, that's so big, right? Humanity had never done anything like that. And then we're in this post moon landing world. And I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and I'm on my way to Turkey to go to Istanbul. And so I'm listening to an audiobook about the history of Istanbul. And I had just listened to an audiobook about Assyrian history. And it's like, man, people and society and culture goes back thousands of years. And it's shocking when you start to pay attention to it, how developed that these societies were 5,000, 6,000 years ago. How close there's this great tablet of Ea Nasir, which is a cuneiform tablet of a dude complaining about the copper ingots that he bought. It's the first written customer complaint 1-star review, right? In cuneiform, uh, people have this common thread, right? There, people are people, and the human experience has this collective nature. And in our current climate, where things are so granular and individual, it's important to remember that. But in this decade, it feels like that was much more obvious. It feels
Mhm.
like that was just built in. And I think that we've come far from there, but one of the signature aspects of the 60s was what you put the nail on the head with the word community. I think that's very right.
Yeah, and I think, as again, as it relates to the music business, and as we start to unpack some of these songs here, another way that it's changed in a very interesting way in terms of how popularity and success is determined is, as we've gone through each episode talking about these songs, we often talk about how many records were sold, or where it charted on the Billboard Hot 100 or whatever. Success was measured throughout this decade and in many subsequent decades, several subsequent decades, by how many records you sold, right? Those were individuals buying your record. So if you sold 1 million copies of Abbey Road, that meant 1 million people had your record. Today, if you have 1 million streams on Spotify, that doesn't mean 1 million people have heard your song. It
No,
means some number of people have played this song 1 million times. That might be 10 people
that
playing
means
the
I'm a
song.
Black Sabbath super fan and I've listened to The Wizard a million times.
And if they have 1,000,001 listens, that means 2 people have listened to The Wizard.
Right.
So success is it's the
Harder to nail down.
impact is measured very differently. They, the Spotify's and Apple Musics of the world want repeats. They want people to stay engaged and continue to listen and listen and listen. In the 60s, you wanted spread, as
Yeah.
many people as possible to engage with this stuff. So it's just it's kind of interesting, when you think about how success is measured and how we think about popularity, because popularity is obviously very different for a number of reasons today. But specific to this conversation, just in terms of how many people are hearing a thing.
Yeah. One final word on community. A lot of the topic, a lot of the subject matter of the songs is like come together and
Yeah.
give peace a chance and the love that we can create. Like,
Mm,
hey, we are empowered. We can do it. We don't have to inherit what is us, and we don't have to settle for what is with the scraps that are left for us. We can make something the way we define it. And if we want to choose this alternate perspective, it's just up to us to make it happen.
right.
Very
Right.
empowering.
It is. It is. All right. Let's get into some of these songs and talk a little bit more granularly about the music of the 1960s. So, just as a recap, we episode 1 of our podcast was a discussion about Link Wray's Rumble. That song came out at the end of the 1950s. That is the only song pre 60s episode that we have done. So Link Wray is the one episode that we will not be talking about in any detail, but I wanted to give props to Link Wray. And there's plenty of other things, whether it be Jerry Lee Lewis or Elvis Presley or Bach and Beethoven that we potentially could have discussed that predate the 60s. But for the purposes of how we decided to approach this show, the 60s is really our jumping off point. the songs we have talked about to cap the '60s, or to give an overview of the heaviness of and the development of heavy in the '60s, were as follows: The Kingsmen's Louie Louie, You Really Got Me by the Kinks, The Witch by the Sonics, I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones, John Coltrane's Ascension, The 13th Floor Elevators, You're Gonna Miss Me, Sunshine of Your Love by Cream, Sister Ray by the Velvet Underground, Voodoo Child or Child by Jimi Hendrix, pick your poison, Iron Butterfly's Mighty Inagata-Davida from 1968. From that same year, Summertime Blues by Blue Cheer, Arthur Brown's Fire, I Want You, She's So Heavy by the Beatles, 21st Century Schizoid Man by King Crimson, Led Zeppelin's Dazed and Confused, the MC5's Kick Out the Jams, Motherfucker, Dachau Blues by Captain Beefheart, and last week, to cap the decade in 1969, we talked about Coven's Wicked Woman. I should note that there are a good number of bands that made their debut in the 1960s that we will talk about but haven't yet, including The Who, The Stooges, and Deep Purple, but several others. So we will get to those. Those are heavy. Those are important to the conversation. We will get to those. And then I also want to mention before we dig into the conversation that, there's some that we opted not to talk about that certainly have heavy in them that we should probably bring into this conversation. They include but are not exclusive to Pink Floyd, The Doors, and the Pink Fairies, none of which we've dedicated episodes to. So all of that to say, Dave, and we'll get into the specifics of the song, and we'll talk about our current Song v Song champions and all of that stuff. But Dave, just broadly speaking about those songs, maybe some of the songs we've missed, the bands we've missed, thoughts now on the heaviness of the '60s?
Yeah, super heavy by any objective standard. And I think that, to punctuate your point, we can't cover every single song because there's so many of them.
Mm-hmm.
And some bands have many. And so what we tried to do is kind of a bouquet of heaviness to be able to really fill out the picture of heavy with maybe some things that might be considered more fringe, um, or people might not consider heavy on a top line, but they have a weight to them. And so that's why we curated this list the way it is. And I think this is a great core sample of elements and bands and songs that are heavy. I didn't know 30% of these songs, never heard them. And so that was fun for me to get to know these. And I've talked before about the hot rod concept of new old stock. You find an old original part that's still new on the shelf from when it was originally manufactured, and you have this brand new old part that is discontinued and otherwise is
I love
unobtainium.
that.
And it sounds like that, right? This is sonic new old stock. I get to listen to these songs, and be like, wow, this is brand new to me, but it has that vintage quality sound, especially like Wicked Woman by Coven, for instance. It sounds like the time, and I'd never heard it. And I went back and I listened to the album, and it was really good. And I enjoyed discovering this whole new, uh, you know, um, there's a paradigm I remember boiled down very crudely from Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, where the mind is like a hallway with a window at the end, and you take psychedelics and all these doors open up and you can start seeing what's in these other rooms, right? That might be I think that's a faithful boiling down of the concept, but that's what it felt like I'm so focused on the now, but there's these rooms like Coven, and I got to like spend time in the Coven room for a little bit. uh it's been really fun. I think these are great examples of heaviness, and I think it's also a great illustration of the generation or the evolution of heavy. It's coming more and more. It's becoming more and more defined.
Mm-hmm. You're giving me great song and album titles, so I had to write down New Old Stock and Bouquet of Heavy. So those
Yeah.
are both very strong. Yeah, I think one of the things that we deliberately did, and I'm pretty happy with, um, kind of the span here is touch across genre and some budding genres or genres that these bands would influence. Whether you go from kind of the garage rock of the Sonics and the Kingsmen to the jazz of Coltrane to the psychedelia of the 13th Floor Elevators to the electric blues of Cream to the art rock of the Velvet Underground, to the hard rock of Zeppelin and the punk of MC5, to the avant-garde of Captain Beefheart, to the occult rock of Coven. I feel like we've covered a good again span of heaviness, of different ways to express heavy, and again, you know, things like hardcore and black metal and drone metal and shoegaze and all of these things would evolve from a lot of these bands and these styles that we've touched on when talking about the 60s.
Yep. Yep.
You
Yeah. Let's
talk you
talk about
talk
some of the songs.
Yeah, so well, but you touched on Coven and the idea of looking into these doors that you hadn't had available to you before. Any other of these songs, in that 30% of those that you hadn't heard before that you feel like might become regular listens for you? Anything particularly sticky here?
Um, would it hurt your feelings if I said no?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Maybe the Sonics, The Witch. I
Mm-hmm.
had never heard that, and I like that song a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's sort of what we
all
talked
the other
about.
ones I thought were interesting, but they didn't grab me in the same way that in that visceral way that music does.
Yeah, yeah. Look, and no, fair enough. You probably don't listen to Mudhoney that much anymore, I would guess.
I,
Um,
I miss them
yeah, that's sort of the Sonic scratch that itch. So if
for
that's not an
sure.
itch that you're typically going to, why would you check them out? Captain Beefheart is a very specific energy. Arthur
Yeah,
Brown, while great, really that fire is really the one song you need. So,
yeah,
that's it's what I love about this is the variety here. I definitely love. I really like multiple times through these episodes. We went back to songs that everybody knows that are really old that I've taken for granted for many years. So to revisit them and kind of analyze them and to reappreciate them has been really fun. Things
sure.
like "You Really Got Me" or "Sunshine of Your Love" or 21st Century Schizoid Man. Those songs that I've had with me for years and years and years, but sort of take for granted and never deliberately put on. But to listen to Satisfaction and without it just being this background song that I've heard 10 million times and go, oh no, this actually is a great song. And that
Right.
riff really was that good to make everybody sit up and pay attention in the 60s. So that part
Or
of it
even
is really fun.
Yeah, or even listening to a song like for this project, we're listening to them academically, and so it's over and over again, and thinking about it and really kind of steeping in it. And so
Yeah.
that's not passing through it in a playlist, right? That's really spending time with this song. And so
Yeah.
that was really, it's been a very pleasant aspect of this whole journey. And so
Sure.
the other thing is, speaking of journey, I meant to bring this up in our prologue. Uh, this episode is an evolution. We just decided on at the last minute. This whole project has been like that, and we're going to add and subtract songs as we go. But it's been really fun evolving and refining this whole project. You introduced song v song just sort of on the fly. That's been a really cool part of this.
Yeah.
Um, And having these decade retrospectives, I think, is a really great way to punctuate and wrap and move on. Um, the decade itself is an evolution of song, and the way I've approached it has been an evolution. So it's been a journey for me, and hopefully for our listeners, they get to appreciate or learning where we're at now. They've earned it too.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I touched on some of those bands: The Doors, the Pink Fairies, Pink Floyd, Slade is another one, maybe. Uh, any of those specifically, or any other bands that we didn't talk about that we are not going to be able to talk about as we start to run out of decades here?
Um, maybe the Zombies. Um,
Hmm,
they
that's a
have
good one.
some. They have a very uh, kind of mysticky sort.
Middle Eastern almost vibe. Yeah, the
Yeah,
Zombies rule. I love the Zombies.
they have a very interesting vibe to them that has a heaviness to it
Mm-hmm.
in that it's a little bit more exotic, and it's got that the thing that I like about the thing that I really like is when heavy music gets a little funky, and they have that little kind of twist to their music that could have been included in here and wasn't.
Yeah, she's not there. Would have been a good song to talk about. I recently saw the Pink Floyd at Pompeii concert film on the big screen, which was awesome, and it prompted me to do a full discography re-listen, which I do periodically. I'm actually doing a Pat Benatar discography deep dive right now for some strange reason. Um, but did Pink
Because it's great.
Floyd?
That's the reason.
Yeah, it's really good. She man,
And it's
she's got
better than you remember. Like when you think about,
she's got some bangers, man. She's got some real
yeah,
bangers. But yeah, Pink Floyd is they were so good and so good in a lot of different ways and so heavy in a very specific, unique way.
yeah,
So I feel like we've shorted ourselves not getting into the album Metal or Umaguma or Atom Heart Mother. There's some stuff on. Even when you get to as deep into As Animals, there's heavy stuff. Even on the Wall, there's heavy stuff. So I
very.
guess I guess if we get into the '70s, we could revisit we could talk about Pink Floyd. I feel like we kind of missed their '60s output, which is great. But what do you think about getting a Pink Floyd song in here somewhere?
I think that's totally appropriate. And one of the things about Pink Floyd is a lot of their stuff is so slow that it's like it's got a gravity to it, right? It's very heavy. It's like syrup, it's just very slow, sticky, sludgy,
Hmm.
with a great depth to it and a lot of character to it. Um, but in its slowness, it has heaviness. It has this gravity.
Yeah. All right. I'll
Pick a winner.
submit a '70s Pink Floyd song to get into the conversation. But let's stick with what we have at hand. Dave mentioned Song v Song. Regular listeners will know that every week we have a current song that we have each have individually deemed as the heaviest song uh, of our current episodes of our past episodes. We pit that up against the weekly current song, and with the idea being when we come out the other end, we'll end up with one song each as the heaviest of all time. But now we need to talk about what we think the heaviest song of the 1960s was, keeping in mind that we can only talk about those songs that we have done episodes on. To date, as of right now, Dave has Coven's Wicked Woman as his song v song champion, and I have the MC5's Kick Out the Jams. But this is going to be our one opportunity to swap those songs for a new champion that we will take into next week's conversation and will be ultimately our '60s song winners. And I think I'm going to change mine, Dave. I think
I
I'm going
am
to change mine.
too. And because I was going to say, necessarily, if we have a current song v song, it would be the song of the decade because it's beat out everything that we had before. But I think that it's just been fun changing them up a little bit because it's no fun to just keep the same one forever. Um, and I'm struggling.
Yeah, I went back and
So you have
listened.
to go first.
Fair enough. I've given this a good amount of thought. Listened to these songs again and again. To and important to note that and this I think this is going to be hard for you to get your head around once Sabbath enters the conversation, but
I have something to
really,
say about that,
I'm sure you do.
but go ahead.
The exercise here is not to pick which one of these is our favorite song. It's not necessarily our favorite song of the 60s nor on this list. But it's what we consider the heaviest, or maybe most important, or most influential, however we individually define heavy, and what we ultimately want to come out of this. And so, I like Kick Out the Jams as much as I like any song on this list. I
Yeah.
absolutely love that song. But when it comes down to heavy with a capital H and everything that means to me in terms of just listening experience, sonically what the song sounds like, but also influence and the music that this song and this band influenced going forward, that would make up so much of my heavy listening up until today. There was kind of only one song that I really could say that is the one. That is my heaviest song of the 1960s. And it came out the year of my birth, so it felt even more appropriate. So my song v song 1960s champion is Iron Butterflies In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. That is the song that I have to take forward.
Wow.
That's
Wow.
that's that's the one, man.
Wow. Interesting, because that's where I was landing, but I've
Yeah.
I've skidded off the runway a little.
Tell me.
Um, it was a real challenge for me between Inagata Devita, Sunshine of Your Love, and Dazed and Confused.
Mm.
And Dazed and Confused is edging out Sunshine of Your Love. And just barely. And it's because it's a little heavier subject. Sunshine of Your Love and Dazed and Confused are both about love, but Sunshine of Your Love is the brightness of it, and Dazed and Confused is the darkness of it. And
Well said.
the the other thing that Dazed and Confused has that I really like about a lot of the heavy music I like is a just total transition in the middle of the song. Um, the bridge that is in Dazed and Confused is just another musical that could be its own song. Uh, and that's one of the things I really like about Sabbath, and that's why I come to heavy music is because of Sabbath. So it's this like gateway progression. Uh, so I'm picking Dazed and Confused, which I'm not a huge Zeppelin fan, but for the purposes of this exercise, I was going in with Inagata Devita, uh, but looking at the song list again, I hearing these songs in my head again, I had to go with Dazed and
Yeah.
Confused. The one thing I wanted to say about Sabbath and the Sabbath episode is they're kind of the elephant in the room, and I'm going to make a rule that Sabbath is its own conversation, and it underpins. We've talked so much about Sabbath that I'm not going to use like the Wizard is my favorite song on this list. I'm just going to spoiler alert. Everybody knows that. I already know
Right.
that. We already know that.
Right. Nothing's beating the Wizard.
Yeah. So that's stupid to take that as a champion. So I'm going to skip that, right? Like that's not going to be part of the song be song conversation for me. Um,
I think that's really smart.
it just would ruin the whole exercise.
Right.
And the point of this is not to ruin the exercise. The point is to really flex the muscle and think about it and like, what do these songs mean, and how do they feel? And that feels better if we just put Sabbath on the pedestal that I put it on, leave it there, and move on.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's really, really smart. I'm glad you're doing that. To go back to this list just briefly again before we wrap it up here, you picked Zeppelin, which I think is awesome. I picked Iron Butterfly. Iron Butterfly, I love Inagata Devita, obviously. I just picked it as the heaviest song of the 1960s. But it's the only song of theirs I know with any kind of depth at all. It's kind of their only song. So if I were to rank all of the bands on this list in the order of how much I listen to them, Iron Butterfly would be pretty low on the list. I'm wondering about Zeppelin and you. You mentioned you weren't a massive Zeppelin fan. When you just look at the bands here, and I didn't prep you for this, so I'm not going to
That's
hold
okay.
you to it. But when you look at this list, where would Zeppelin rank in terms of just frequency of listen? Not Dazed and Confused specifically, but just broadly against all of these other bands, and a bunch of these bands you'd never heard. But
Interestingly, behind Iron Butterfly, I listened to that Iron Butterfly album periodically, and I rarely listen to Zeppelin.
yeah.
Because it was on our list, I ended up listening to a bunch of Zeppelin, and I haven't gone back to it since the few weeks that we've done that. And there's a lot of good stuff there. It's just when I found that Inagata Devita song, it was in the album, and so I listened to the album, and so I have a lot of exposure to the album. There's two other songs on there that I do like,
Mm-hmm.
and that they have a bit of a dark, exotic quality to them, and lead singer's voice is so strong, and there's the organ is unique, but it's metalized, if you will. Um, so yeah, I listen to Iron Butterfly more than Zeppelin, and there is nobody else that I regularly listen to. Cream shows up a couple of times because I've got a couple of their songs in some playlists. Um, but I'm reminded that I really like Jimi Hendrix, and I should put some Jimi Hendrix songs in my playlist. And I just
Mm-hmm.
because because I've missed it. Uh, so and it's I've mentioned this before. It's hard for me to think about music. You and I think about music very differently.
Mm-hmm.
Music is so emotional for me that it's much easier to pick a music of the emotion that I'm in than to decide what emotion I want to be in. And so creating a playlist of an emotion that I want to be in is harder for me because it is an emotion that I'm going to end up being. And I don't spend enough time in a space where I can listen to songs, a snippet of a song, and be like, oh yeah, that's going to go in this playlist and that's going to go in that playlist. It takes a lot of time. Recently got a 360 video camera for motorcycle rides, and all the time is in editing. Like I've got all this footage I'm never going to edit. And so it's a similar kind of thing. Like I just don't have time to sit in front of the computer and think about these things. Um, and when I think about them, it's quickly, and there's a world of things, and so I end up doing playlists of stuff that's right in front of me and forget about things like Jimi Hendrix because it's off my radar. So again, this exercise is reminding me of the stuff that I already like. And Mudhoney, I got to get Mudhoney into playlists here because I forgot that I like them.
Yeah, I mean, music is extremely emotional for me, but the way I have over 100 Spotify playlists. Some
Yeah,
are built around themes, some are built around genre, some are built around artist, what a decade, all kinds of things. And when I hear a Mudhoney song, which, in all seriousness, I literally did a couple of days ago that I hadn't heard in forever, and I'm like, grab that and drop this in this one playlist. It's because that song is a specific mood that will fit on this playlist. That when I'm in that mood, I will go to that playlist. So I we share the emotional response to music. I think where we differ is I have an anal retentive organization around organizing those emotions, which
Yeah.
is maybe weird. Um, but back to Iron Butterfly, just because this is a kind of a fun exercise and it relates to what we were talking about earlier about streaming listens or streams of a song versus selling physical copies earlier. And Iron Butterfly is a great illustration of that. So Iron Butterfly, to no one's surprise, their most popular song on Spotify is Inagata Vida, the single version, which has 37,577 plays. Their second most popular song is Inagata Vida, the full length album version, which has 18 million plays. Their third most popular song on Spotify is called Unconscious Power, which has 3 million plays. So if you combine the two versions of Inagata Vida, it's got over 60 million plays, and their next closest song has 3 million. So that will give you a sense of the Iron Butterfly catalog and how it's been considered over the years, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Um, yeah, so to continue the thread with Inagata Devita, the other two songs that I like on that album are My Mirage and Are You Happy?
Mm.
Are You Happy in particular has a very kind of dark, a very Bach organ
Mm.
composition to it. Uh, so interesting, very interesting. And I just saw, as you were talking, I pulled up Inagata Devita and I saw some Reddit posts. It's like, Inagata Devita sold 30 million copies? That can't be right. Like, it can be. Like, especially when we think of the conversation that we had. It was unique in its time, but it was also a coalescing moment of its time. It was heavy, it was psychedelic, it was musical, it was about love in the Garden of Eden. It was a confluence of points of interest and points of connection and stream of consciousness that were emerging. It's 1966, right? It's still emerging, it's bubbling. And all of a sudden, there it was at the surface for this moment, and they captured it in a song. And from there, there's a platform because this 1968 happens after 1966 and because of 1966. So sonically, things are different, and they're different because they have the permission that Inagata Devita gave. Iron Butterfly gave him permission.
Yeah, I just pulled it up. It is crazy that record went 4 times platinum on the strength of that one song, making those guys. It's like writing Happy Birthday. Like you never have
Yeah,
to write anything ever again.
it's a good song. It
It's a
just
good
turns out
song,
it's a good song.
which is why it is my heaviest song of the 1960s. Dazed and Confused is certainly no slouch either. That is Dave's heaviest song of the 1960s. Not only will we take it into the conversation next week with about Black Sabbath, understanding Dave's caveat, but we will also ultimately pit it against whatever our 1970s champion is, regardless of how it fares throughout the 1970s. So we'll do some different variations on the song v song thing, so we can compare and contrast decades and styles of music and genre and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think a good way to think of it, getting back to the dangerous sports metaphors, the decade song v song is the all star, right? And we're going to have an all stars like series, and we're going to have our regular season.
Dave,
Huh? How am I doing? How am I
I
doing?
think you're a closeted sports guy, dude. I
Listen,
think well, for first pitch of the Dodger game is 110 today, so I'll text you when Tony Gonsolin takes the bump, and we'll see how his slider is breaking.
all right. Well, I'm hoping for a touchdown early. Um, Listen, hanging out with you, I get a musical education, I get a sports education. It's nothing but fun. It's good times, buddy.
Well, I'm getting not only a motorcycle education, but apparently also an education on Istanbul, which I did not anticipate. So I appreciate
Not
that.
Constantinople. That's nobody's business but the Turks. To bring it back into a song.
I love it. I love it. Thanks for listening, everybody. That was awesome, Dave. Look forward to next week. We finally get to Sabbath, and we will talk about the Wizard. Thanks for listening, everybody. Stay heavy.
Okay, thank you. Bye.